In 20 years' time, you could have a situation where the presidents of America and China, the Prime Minister of India, and a representative from Europe, because I'm sure we'll still be a disparate, squabbling lot, will meet in a room and decide the course of human destiny. They will determine, it won't be a question of a G8, because the world will have turned back to something like it was before the last 500 years. When Professor Kennedy, not John Kennedy, wrote his Rise and Fall of Great Powers about 15 years ago, he started it by saying, if an alien civilization had visited Earth 500 years ago and decided where to land to meet the leadership of the human race, it would not have been anywhere in Europe. It might have been in the area of Islam, it might have been somewhere on the Indian subcontinent, or most probably in China. At that stage, that was the balance of economic forces. And then slavery, the discovery of the New World, all of that has given 500 years in which Europe and America have dominated the whole world, organised it to their own convenience. That world is passing. And we can either have the passing of that world as violent and divisive and threatening human civilization, or we can recognise that power and wealth would inevitably, for the rest of human history, be shared. And that is the alternative that I prefer to see. That as those new great economic powers emerge, we don't try and see a nexus around the White House and Wall Street and Washington trying to impose one culture on the rest of the world, because I think that is doomed to fail. We should actually allow a genuine global culture to emerge. Finally, I say this, because much of this debate is actually now underpinned not in the very academic terms of the Clash of Civilizations essay 15 years ago, but in the crude Islamophobia of the worst of the media, both here and in America. And if you want to see the worst of it, go to the websites, where you see articles about how European civilization is being eaten away from within by a Muslim underclass, driven to impose their belief in their superior ideology on the Europe that they're infecting. And it's exactly those terms, absolutely vile. But then you actually compare that with the reality of the success of London, the only place in Europe that matches American levels of economic productivity and competitiveness, largely because of our openness, largely because we don't share those attitudes. And then you actually look, and if you do opinion polls about the great issues, they're not necessarily as revealing because people come to them with a preconceived view. I end with one interesting statistic. It was an analysis that was done by the Equal Opportunities Commission about the prospects in this country of young Muslim women. And for all the depiction of this, and it's been a horrendous debate about the veil, what that showed, the EOC interviewed 1,000 16-year-old Muslim women. They found that those women were highly motivated and determined to achieve independence and success in their careers. In the vast majority of cases, their parents supported their ambitions. Contrary to stereotype, 90% of Pakistani and Bangladeshi girls said their parents did not expect them to get married and have children rather than follow a career. And it is that decision, the decisions of tens of millions of ordinary people, the decisions of 16-year-old girls about how they will live their life, they demonstrate, they are choosing what they see as best in a range of competing cultures and civilizations. And if we respect their choices and celebrate that diversity, we can have a world that does not repeat the mistakes of the Cold War and divert its wealth and create a slaughter of competing civilizations, but create a genuine global one in which we make the clear distinction. Each individual matters. Each individual shall make their own choice. Thank you very much.
I'd like to call on now Daniel Pipes, who is director of the Middle East Forum and is also a visiting professor at Pepperdine University.
Thank you so much. I'd like to begin by thanking Mayor Livingstone for his kind invitation to join you today. I thank the Greater London Authority for the hard work it put into what is obviously a successful event. And I'm delighted by the interest that you, the audience, have shown. And I'm grateful to my supporters who have come actually from 4 different countries to be with me today. The mayor is an optimistic man. I'm generally invited when people want some gloom, and I will, true to form, provide some for you. Let me start by my position on the question of a world civilization or a clash of civilizations. 1, I am for a world civilization, and I reject the clash of civilization argument. 2, the problem is not so much a clash of civilizations, but a clash of civilization and barbarism. Now, I'd like to begin by looking at Samuelton Huntington's idea. He argued that cultural differences, back in his 1993 article, are paramount. Quote, the fundamental source of conflict will not be primarily ideological or primarily economic. The great divisions among humankind and the dominating source of conflict will be cultural. And in all he finds 7 or 8 such civilizations, namely Western, Confucian, Japanese, Islamic, Hindu, Slavic Orthodox, Latin American, and perhaps, he says, African. My response is that civilization is useful as a cultural concept, but not as a political one. There are 3 problems with seeing civilizations as actors in the way that Huntington suggests. First, it can't account for tensions within a single civilization. It can't account for agreement across civilizations, and it doesn't account for change over time. Let me give you 3 quick examples. And I'll take them from the area that I study, namely the Muslim world. First, it cannot account for Muslim on Muslim violence, of which there's a great deal, be it the civil war in Lebanon, the Iraq-Iran war, the Islamist insurgency in Algeria, the Sunnis versus Shias in Iraq at present, the near civil war in the Palestinian Authority, the Sudanese government against the people of Darfur. This cannot be accounted for in civilizational terms. Second, it ignores the agreement across civilizations, and I'd like to take a UK-based example of that, namely the edict of Ayatollah Khomeini in 1989 against Salman Rushdie, who at that time was living in London. It appeared, at first glance, to be a question of Muslims on one side and Westerners on the other. Muslims were burning the Satanic Verses novel, there was violence in India, and so forth. But a closer look showed that, in fact, it was quite something different. That it was far more complex. There were plenty of Westerners who were hostile to Rushdie and plenty of Muslims who supported him. Let me give you just a couple of quotes. The Foreign Secretary of Britain at that time, Sir Geoffrey Howe, said, the British government, the British people do not have any affection for Rushdie's book. On the other hand, the Egyptian Foreign Minister said Khomeini had no right to sentence Rushdie to death, and another Egyptian minister said, Khomeini is a dog. No, that is too good for him. He is a pig. Third point, Huntington, in his analysis, can't account for change over time, and I can best illustrate this by giving you a quote from his 1993 article. He said, the economic issues between the United States and Europe are no less serious than those between the United States and Japan. But they do not have the same political salience and emotional intensity because the differences between American culture and European culture are so much less than those between American civilization and Japanese civilization. Well, that was true enough in 1993, but it sounds pretty silly in 2007, when there are virtually no tensions between the United States and Japan, and I'm sure you're aware of the tensions between the United States and Europe. The vituperation is far more severe across the Atlantic than the Pacific. What Huntington did was to take an incident of the moment and turn it into something civilizational, and it didn't work. In short, the clash of civilization idea fails. It does not fit the facts. It is not a good way to understand the world. What about then a world civilization? Can it exist? If one defines it as Huntington does, as a culture, basically, no, it can't. As he puts it correctly, for the relevant future there will be no universal civilization, but instead a world of different civilizations, each of which will have to learn to coexist with the others. Don't think anyone would dispute that. But yes, there can be a world civilization if one defines it differently. Civilization can be the opposite of barbarism. And civilization, in this sense, has a long history. In the Bible, there's a passage, "And ye shall proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto the inhabitants thereof." In the Quran, "You are the best community ever raised among mankind. You advocate righteousness and forbid evil, and you believe in God." The American byword is the pursuit of happiness. The French is liberté, égalité, et fraternité. Winston Churchill, in 1898, writing about the Sudan, said that civilization is sympathetic, merciful, tolerant, ready to discuss or argue, eager to avoid violence, to submit to the law, to effect compromise. So the question is, can this state of being civilized, can it exist on a world level? It can, insofar as those who are civilized confront those who are not civilized. A world civilization consists of civilized elements in every culture banding together to protect ethics, liberty, and mutual respect. The real clash is between them and the barbarians. Now, what do I mean by barbarians? I do not mean people of a lower economic standard. What I mean by barbarians, I think all of us mean by barbarians in the past 2 centuries, which is ideological barbarians. This is what emerged in the French Revolution in the late 18th century. And the great examples of ideological barbarism are fascism and Marxist-Leninism. They, in their course of their histories, have killed tens of millions of people. But today it's a third totalitarian movement, a third barbarian movement, namely that of radical Islam. It is an extremist, utopian version of Islam. I'm not speaking of Islam, the religion. I'm speaking of a very unusual and modern reading of Islam. It has inflicted misery, as I mentioned Algeria and Darfur before. There's suicide terrorism, there are tyrannical and brutal governments, there's the oppression of women and non-Muslims. It threatens the whole world. Morocco, Turkey, Palestinian Authority, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, you name it, Afghanistan, Indonesia, and not just the traditional Muslim world, but also Russia, France, Sweden, and I dare say the United Kingdom. The great question of our time is how to prevent this movement, akin to fascism and communism, from growing stronger. Now, I believe the mayor and I agree on the need to withstand this menace, but we disagree on the means of how to do it. He looks to multiculturalism, and I to winning the war. He wants everyone to get along. I want to defeat the terrible enemy. Now, the mayor defines multiculturalism as the right to pursue different cultural values subject only to the restriction that they should not interfere with a similar right for others. And he argues, as you've just heard, that it works, that London is a successful city. And I won't dispute his specifics, but I do see the multicultural impulse breeding a disaster by ignoring a dangerous and growing presence of radical Islam in London. One evocative sign of this danger is that your city and your country have become a threat for the rest of the world. In 2003, Home Secretary David Blunkett presented a dossier to the Special Immigration Appeals Commission, in which he, quote, admits that Britain was a safe haven for supporters of worldwide terrorism, and in which he said, Britain remains a significant base for supporting terrorism. And indeed, British-based terrorists have carried out operations in at least 15 countries, going from east to west, roughly speaking, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kenya, Tanzania, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, Algeria, Morocco, Russia, France, Spain, and the United States. To give you one example, from the United States, it was Richard Reed, the would-be shoe bomber, who I'm primarily thinking of, but there was also a role in 9/11. There was also a role in the Millennium Plot that did not take place in Los Angeles. In frustration, Egypt's President Hosni Mubarak publicly denounced the UK for, quote, protecting killers after the August 10th thwarted Heathrow airline mega plot of a few months ago. 2 American authors argued in the New Republic that from an American point of view, it, quote, can now be argued that the biggest threat to U.S. security emanates not from Iraq, not from Iran, not from Afghanistan, but rather from Great Britain. And I believe this is the tip of the iceberg. I believe it refutes Mr. Livingstone's rosy reading. There is a problem, and the problem is radical Islam, also known as fundamentalist Islam or political Islam, Islamism. It is not, again, Islam, the religion. It is radical Islam, the ideology. To focus on 3 aspects of it. The essence of radical Islam is the complete adherence to